This video is actually the second part of a series I'm doing, exploring the characters and the ideas and the mythological themes and philosophy of Ragnarok. The first video covers the story of Ragnarok itself, some of the archaeology and meanings, and lays the groundwork for this video. So if you're not as familiar with Ragnarok, or if you want to see that, I highly encourage checking out that video first and then coming back here to watch this one. When the end eventually comes, the gods march out to fight, though their fates are sealed. In Germanic society, the belief in fate was paramount, a belief that your life was predestined, your death was written out in the threads of the Norns. But even knowing the prophecies, if Odin had revealed this information to the other gods, the gods choose to meet their destinies with courage and honor, much like men of Midgard are expected to do. The mythic stage is set through both human failures and the gods' proud choices to provoke their twilight. Ragnarok is the culmination of the failures within the preceding sagas. No man will have mercy on another. Brothers will fight and kill each other. Sisters' children will defile kinship. It is harsh in the world, whoredom rife, an axe age, a sword age, shields are riven, a wind age, a wolf age, before the world goes headlong. There are still more clues to its meaning hidden in the 13th century poem itself. Snorri Sturluson describes the binding of the wolf Fenrir by the gods, and likewise Loki is bound in this way, with venom dropping onto his face from a snake placed by the Jotun Skadi. This foretells how the gods themselves took actions that led to their own doom, binding the wolf that would break free and attack them, and binding Loki, whose writhing would unleash earthquakes. Ragnarok does not emerge out of nothing. It is a direct consequence of the behaviors which led to it. Here, Ragnarok is presaged by humanity's moral dissolution, an age of conflict, lust, vice, kinslaying. The world is already on a course to disaster before the prophesied events of the end times begin. In this passage, we can also hear clear resonance with Tolkien's Rohirrim, when the figure of King Theoden, before the great cavalry charge at the Battle of Pelennor Fields, shouts to his riders, "Spear shall be shaken, shield shall be splintered, a sword day, a red day, ere the sun rises. Ride now, ride now, ride, ride for ruin and the world's ending." In Tolkien's world, we see this moment of total Ragnarok for the men of Middle-earth, who ride out to meet their doom with northern courage. In Tolkien's Middle-earth, each civilization has an ultimate reckoning, the destruction of Númenor, the War of the Ring. At the time of Aragorn, this is the Ragnarok of the Third Age, culminating in deaths of great heroes and a renewal and rebinding of man and woman in the marriages that follow, eventually to be followed by a later apocalypse, as alluded to in the great battle speech by Aragorn himself. "A day may come when the courage of men fails, when we forsake our friends and break all bonds of fellowship. But it is not this day. An hour of wolves and shattered shields when the age of men comes crashing down. But it is not this day. This day we fight. By all that you hold dear on this good earth, I bid you stand, men of the West." As Tolkien writes in his lecture Beowulf, The Monsters and the Critics, he describes the morality and needed fatalism of the northern gods. They are doomed to die the same as men. The southern, Roman and Greek pagan gods were immortal, so to Tolkien, a Christian, the southern religion, quote, "must go forward to philosophy or relapse into anarchy."
How do you get yourself out of a rut? You start paying deeper attention to the things around you and inside you. You referred to that as, quote, death ground.
Wrote a book on strategy, my version of The Art of War. It's inspired from Sun Tzu, the great Chinese strategist, but it has vast philosophical implications. The idea is when necessity is pressing in on you, like your back is against the wall, like you have to get something done, and there's like this pressure around you, you find energy in there that you never believed before. When you feel like your life's in danger, suddenly you can leap over things that you never could leap over before. So Sun Tzu says, put an army on death ground and it will fight until it wins, meaning put an army with its back to the ocean or a back to the mountain, and it's either win or die. They're going to fight 10 times harder. You're going to find the energy in you that you normally lack when death is facing you in the face, or urgency, or deadlines, or people pressing in on you. You need to put yourself on death ground. You need to feel that barometric pressure, which is the actual reality. The actual reality is you could die tomorrow. You could have a stroke tomorrow. You could be fired tomorrow. Everything could fall apart. You need to have that sense of urgency now, because that's the reality. You're fooling yourself by thinking you have all of this time. Suddenly, you can move mountains. You have energy. You just have focus. Neurologically, everything clicks in, you know? And people who've had that experience where they've felt like the ship was going under and they better get their act together and survive, they talk about all these physical processes. I have a story about a mountain climber. He was climbing this mountain by himself. He was having a great time, but there was a storm coming and he had to get down. And he suddenly fell and he cut his leg open massively. And there was like a branch sticking in it. He broke all these bones and he was gonna die. He was on a ledge. He could see that it was getting dark and storm clouds were massing. This was in the Rocky Mountains. He was alone, and suddenly he managed to get up on his 2 feet. He can't explain how, but all of this energy, all this adrenaline started flowing in him. And he said he was like a mountain goat. He was like going down the ledge. He jumped. He was able to kind of get down to another ledge. He got out of it. And for the next 20 years, he was haunted by, how did that happen? I want that feeling again, because it was actually the most ecstatic feeling. I had energy that I never suspected in myself.
Tolkien goes further in discussing what constitutes northern courage when he writes the following. One of the most potent elements in that fusion is the northern courage, the theory of courage, which is the great contribution of early northern literature. This is not a military judgment. I am not asserting that, if the Trojans could have employed a northern king and his companions, they would have driven Agamemnon and Achilles into the sea more decisively than the Greek hexameter routes the alliterative line, though it is not improbable. I refer rather to the central position the creed of unyielding will holds in the north. With due reserve, we may turn to the tradition of pagan imagination as it survived in Icelandic. Of English pre-Christian mythology, we know practically nothing. But the fundamentally similar heroic temper of ancient England and Scandinavia cannot have been founded, or perhaps rather cannot have generated, mythologies divergent on this essential point. The northern gods, Kerr said, have an exultant extravagance in their warfare, which makes them more like Titans than Olympians. Only they are on the right side, though it is not the side that wins. The winning side is chaos and unreason, mythologically the monsters. But the gods, who are defeated, think that defeat no refutation. And in their war, men are chosen allies, able when heroic to share in this absolute resistance, perfect because without hope. At least in this vision of the final defeat of the humane and of the divine made in its image, and in the essential hostility of the gods and heroes on the one hand and the monsters on the other, we may suppose that pagan English and Norse imagination agreed. This is the secret of martyrdom, that defeat is no refutation, that death holds a glory all its own, and the manner of death is what separates glory from ignominy. Another poem from the North Atlantic, which intertwines Christian and pre-Christian Northern European beliefs, is that of Beowulf. In the essay Beowulf and the Heroic Age, The Australian knight and professor of English language and literature, Sir Archibald Thomas Strong, writes, "In the epoch of Beowulf, a heroic age more wild and primitive than that of Greece is brought into touch with Christendom, with the Sermon on the Mount, with Catholic theology and the ideas of heaven and hell. We see the difference if we compare the wilder things, the folktale element in Beowulf, with the wilder things of Homer. Take for example the tale of Odysseus and the Cyclops, the no-man trick. Odysseus is struggling with a monstrous and wicked foe, but he is not exactly thought of as struggling with the powers of darkness. Polyphemus, by devouring his guests, acts in a way which is hateful to Zeus and the other gods. Yet the Cyclops is himself God-begotten and under divine protection, and the fact that Odysseus has maimed him is a wrong which Poseidon is slow to forgive. But the gigantic foes whom Beowulf has to meet are identified with the foes of God. Grendel and the dragon are constantly referred to in language which is meant to recall the powers of darkness with which Christian men felt themselves to be encompassed. They are the inmates of hell, adversaries of God, offspring of Cain, enemies of mankind. Consequently, the matter of the main story of Beowulf, monstrous as it is not so far removed from common medieval experience as it seems to us from our own. Grendel hardly differs from the fiends of the pit, who are always in ambush to waylay a righteous man. And so Beowulf, for all that he moves in the world of the primitive heroic age of the Germans, nevertheless is almost a Christian knight. In reading Norse mythology, I'm struck by many of the meta-parallels in the grand arc of the stories with the meta-narrative of Christianity. Both tell of our most ancient origins and end with a prophecy about the future and the end and rebirth of the world. By the time Snorri Sturluson wrote down these ancient stories, it's reasonable to assume a certain amount of Christianization took place in the writing in the vein of the poem Heliand. But even still, I can't help but think that, like branches on a tree, they are both calling back to the same primordial truth of the world. Germanic belief in this way never truly left far from the tree of Genesis. Both present a cyclic, if not repeating, view of creation and destruction. The world is created, falls into corruption, is destroyed, and then is created anew. Genesis depicts the Garden of Eden with Adam and Eve much like Ask and Embla, followed by the flood, while Ragnarok sees the world reborn after floods and fiery destruction. Moral failings of the humans play a key role in both myths. In Genesis, humanity's sins unleash God's wrath via the flood. In Ragnarok, moral decay precedes the apocalypse with greed, adultery, and kinslaying. Both link apocalypse to moral decline. A new righteous human world emerges after the old sinful world perishes. Noah and his family survive the flood and repopulate the earth, and likewise at Revelation, there is a new heavens and a new earth. Both associate the apocalypse with human rebirth and renewal, as well as the renewal and rebirth of the natural world. Judgment Day in Christian eschatology also finds echoes in the epic battles of Ragnarok, where gods and divine beings confront evil forces and beasts and dragons and monsters, and meet their destined fates, resulting in tragic death and in renewal. Figures like Surtur and Fenrir can be seen as demonic adversaries of the gods, similar to the Antichrist, the beast from the sea, the great dragon, which is Satan, and the other strange beings and creatures which are described in Revelation. The binding of Loki leading to earthquakes also parallels Revelation's prophecy that Satan would be bound and cast into prison before being released prior to Armageddon. An unofficial student of Friedrich Nietzsche, German philosopher Oswald Spengler, with his philosophy of civilizational decline, resonates with the tragic yet heroic themes in Tolkien's Middle-earth, the Book of Revelation, and Norse Ragnarok. Like the Norse gods fated for destruction at Ragnarok, Spengler saw cultures as organic entities that experience a birth, a maturation, and an eventual decay.
I should like to begin by asking Secretary Kissinger why he thought to give President Nixon to read a one-volume edition of Spengler's Decline of the West.
I had discussed my early interest in philosophy of history with President Nixon. I pointed out to him that Spengler, many of whose conclusions I didn't agree, nevertheless in his perception of the rise and fall of civilizations as integrated units, that is to say, in which politics, art, architecture, science were all part of the same perception, that was an interesting way of looking at the problem of civilization, not necessarily a prediction of our civilization.
Well, did you expect that he would learn to see more acutely what was happening to our civilization simply by mastering Spengler's technique or by sharing in Spengler's Weltschmerz?
Well, first of all, I think it is incorrect to say that Spengler suffered from Weltschmerz. What Spengler attempted to do is to show that civilizations follow a certain rhythm and a certain sequence of events, and it is therefore wrong to say he's optimistic or pessimistic. It is more important to understand whether his perception had some validity. The reason, however, that I discussed this with President Nixon to emphasize that the manifestation of events which come up in the form of tactical decisions are very often quite misleading, and that a statesman has to understand what the trend of events is, whether it is in a positive or in a negative direction, and has to understand that there are many seemingly unrelated manifestations of a total culture.
Beings and civilizations like Tolkien's elves and Númenóreans epitomize this in their passing from Middle-earth. As Spengler wrote, death following life, rigidity following expansion. Revelation and Ragnarok likewise depict civilizations facing apocalyptic ends, with corrupting forces overtaking wisdom and purity and development built over generations. Spengler's pessimism aligns with the Norse view of an inevitable decline from a heroic age into chaos and conflict preceding Ragnarok. Tolkien's works convey this arc from glory faded into twilight with cyclical civilizational deaths and rebirths along the great span of history. Revelation degenerates from a sinless world into corruption and all manner of human failings before wrathful judgment and the glorious return of Christ. Each sees the apocalypse as the inevitable culmination of a series of civilizational rises and falls. Yet within this bleak outlook lie sparks of heroism and redemption. The greater the challenge and the darker the night, the greater the courage. The Norse gods charge out of Valhall in the bleak night of Ragnarok, even after the very sun and moon of the sky are devoured and extinguished. The Aesir and the Einhar and the Valkyries still fight side by side in the blackness of total night. Tolkien's flawed yet steadfast characters like Aragorn and Boromir epitomize this struggle. In Revelation, the faithful stand to the end, even with persecution and martyrdom. Spengler saw cultures as undergoing a cyclical journey of growth and decay, writing, "I see in place of that empty figment of one linear history, the drama of a number of mighty cultures, each springing with primitive strength from the soil of a mother region to which it remains firmly bound throughout its whole life cycle." This aligns with the Norse view of Asgard's doomed arc from its origins to fiery destruction. Tolkien's realms like Gondor and Rohan poetically reflect the drama of cultures rising and falling across Middle-earth's history. When a culture decays into mere civilization, Spengler argued it becomes characterized by imperialism and mass society, again reflected in Ragnarok's vision of Babylon's totalizing and industrial-scale idolatry and oppression. In Spengler's writings, we find this great sweep of cultures rising and falling that Tolkien mythologized in Middle-earth's lore and long backstories and origins of defeated kingdoms that were once great and are since lost to time, and that Norse mythology tells of through Asgard and Midgard's destruction. and which Revelation prophesies of via Babylon's judgment. So if Ragnarok is inescapable, even for the gods, how are we to face it? Friedrich Nietzsche proposed that comprehending existence as endless recurrence is humanity's heaviest burden, but he called for boldly embracing and loving one's fate in this cycle, amor fati. The Norse gods epitomized this spirit by facing Ragnarok's destructive prophecy with courage and nobility. Though their doom is foretold, they march to battle with heads held high, sanctifying their final moments through deed and valor. Nietzsche defined amor fati as loving one's fate and wanting nothing to be different, not forward, not backward, not in all eternity. This stoic embrace of reality per se rings through the Norse gods' courage facing Ragnarok's prophesied doom. Tolkien's characters in the Fellowship, like Sam and Frodo, likewise accept their quest's heavy burden, not detached, but committed to redeeming their imperfect world and embracing their role in the quest. Similarly, Camus also spoke of a will to live without rejecting anything of life, which is the virtue I honor most in this world. And at the moment of history, Christ pronounces, "Not my will, but thine be done," consecrating the road ahead. The virtuous characters of Middle-earth exhibit this same tragic heroism. They fight their war against Sauron, knowing victory is uncertain, mortality inescapable. But their struggle gives each fleeting second significance, capturing Nietzsche's idea of amor fati as the defiant love of one's fate. Spengler admired those who resisted rather than surrendered to their culture's decline. In the same spirit, the gods march to Ragnarok, and Tolkien's heroes stand against the darkness, elevates their bravery in a universe ruled by a cosmic battle between light and darkness. This philosophy of rises and eventual falls lends Germanic mythology and Middle-earth its aura of poignant tragedy. The long defeat seems woven into the fabric of reality. But in daring to love fate and redeem each moment through courage and bonds of fellowship, the heroic shines ever brighter against the coming night. Stephen Borthwick, in his paper The Decline of Civilizations, W.B. Yeats and Oswald Spengler's New Historiography of Civilization, writes of their view on amor fati, saying, "This embrace of the eternal recurrence, the act of accepting the eternal return and through it, actively willing it, is the beginning of the transvaluation of all values, which itself is the new structure for the new age proposed by Nietzsche. For Yeats, the transvaluation of all values might be found in the new cosmology he is creating." Likewise, Spengler declares an amor fati, writing that it all hangs on this, that one makes clear and understands this situation, this destiny, about which one can lie to oneself but never avoid. Who does not admit this to himself does not count among the men of his generation. Christ's narrative profoundly embodies this interplay between cyclical return and loving and embracing fate that links Spengler's philosophy to Ragnarok and Tolkien's legends. The Gospels present Christ's life, death, and resurrection as the pivotal cycle transforming all of history. His miraculous birth is the end of one era, the era of the Old Testament in the Old World, while his crucifixion heralds the end times and the new world foretold in Revelation. Christ's passion takes place at the decay and the twilight of one age, and his birth of the new age, before Christ to Anno Domini. Cyclical rebirth emerges after death's darkest hour. Christ returns from the tomb as Scripture rises from Ragnarok's ashes, a story rejuvenated across the epochs to shape civilization anew. The call to embrace thy fate rings through the suffering of the cross, redeeming tragedy through passion. The Fellowship of Middle-earth aligns with the apostles, who lovingly and courageously followed Christ, although many of them stumbled, but who were redeemed towards their fated end. Gondor stands vigil over the long defeat embodied in Mordor, echoing Revelation's churches persevering through tribulation. Where Norse gods ride to doom with heads unbowed, Aragorn marches to Mordor, embracing his role as challenger of the forces of darkness. The feeling of amorphosity is evoked beautifully in the quote from the film Troy. The gods envy us. They envy us because we're mortal, because any moment may be our last. Everything is more beautiful because we are doomed. You will never be lovelier than you are now. We will never be here again. Let me not then die ingloriously and without a struggle. But first let me do something great that shall be told among men hereafter. This ecstatic fatalism is embodied throughout Nordic literature, such as in verse 78 of Havamal, which extols the value of embracing glory and heroic death. Cattle die and kinsmen die, and so one dies oneself. One thing now that never dies, the fame of a dead man's deeds. In the open forum of a 1944 Oxford talk, C.S. Lewis on the subject of Ragnarok responded to a student saying, "We have the twilight of the gods. All this time, silently, unceasingly, out of all reach of human power. Nature, the old enemy, has been steadily gnawing away. The sun will cool. All suns will cool. The whole universe will run down. Life, every form of life, will be banished, without hope of return, from every inch of infinite space. All ends in nothingness, and universal darkness covers all. The pattern of the myth thus becomes one of the noblest we can conceive. It is the pattern of many Elizabethan tragedies, where the protagonist's career can be represented by a slowly ascending and then rapidly falling curve, with its highest point in Act 4. You see him climbing up and up, then blazing in his bright meridian, then finally overwhelmed in ruin."
Can I ask about some of the one or two more books that you ask your students at the Rogue Film School to read?
Yeah, for example, I brought with me the Poetic Edda, truly wonderful piece of reading, and the Poetic Edda, for example. And I was somebody who has held the Codex Regius in my hands twice in my life already, a little crumpled parchment text, which is a little bit like the Dead Sea Scrolls for Israel. That's a book for Iceland. It goes into this mythological life and description of the creation of the world. And it's very strong, and I always try to tell people who make documentaries, go read the Edda, read the depth and the myth that can all of a sudden come out of very simple things that you do not notice unless you have a sensory organ for the mythological. Here it says Völuspá Edda, the creation of the world, and here, in earliest times did Ymir live, was nor sea nor land, nor salty waves, neither earth was there nor upper heaven, but a gaping nothing, and green things nowhere. Was the land then lifted aloft by Bur's sons, who made Midgard, the matchless earth. The matchless earth is just very beautiful. Shown from the south, the sun on dry land, on the ground then grew, the greensward soft. This kind of love for these things, I cannot describe it.
Oswald Spengler also writes in The Decline of the West, Volume 1, on the Norsemen, that, quote, "It was the spirit of the Vikings and the Hansa, as of those dim peoples, so unlike the Hellenes with their domestic funerary urns, who heaped up great barrows as memorials of the lonely soul on the wide plains. It was the spirit of those who sent their dead kings to sea in their burning ships, thrilling manifests of their dark yearning for the boundless, The spirit of the Norsemen drove their cockle boats in the 10th century that heralded the Faustian birth to the coasts of America. The will to power, to use Nietzsche's great formula, that from the earliest Gothic of the Eddas, the cathedrals and crusades, and even from the old conquering Goths and Vikings, has distinguished the attitude of the northern soul to its world, appears also in the sense transcending energy. What the myth of Götterdämmerung signified of old, the irreligious form of it, the theory of entropy, signifies today. World's end as completion of an inwardly necessary evolution. He goes on to say, lastly, consider Western tragedy. Observe how the same feeling leads it to prefer historical material, meaning thereby not so much demonstrably actual or even possible, but remote encrusted subjects. That which the Faustian soul wanted and must have could not be expressed by any event of purely momentary meaning, lacking in distance of time or place, or by a tragic art of the classical kind, or by a timeless myth. Our tragedies, consequently, are tragedies of the past and of the future, the latter category, in which men yet to be are shown as carriers of a destiny, is represented in a certain sense by Faust, Peter Gynt, and the Götterdämmerung. What Spengler means by this is that the Western soul seeks to make tragedy not just something of the distant past, but of the future, something yet to be experienced. Tragedy thereby is embodied in end times mythology. It is something we are yet to face and have already faced and will face again. It is like Odin with his battle preparations, something to be worked toward. In John Tolkien's lecture, The Monsters and the Critics, he says, in Norse mythology, things are quite different. The gods are very much within time, and though they are powerful, strange, and enigmatic like the Greek gods, they are a lot more human. For like mortals, they are not in control, and they are in constant conflict with the powers of evil. In this war against the monsters, the gods must ally themselves with men. Men who are killed in battle go to Valhalla. There they prepare for war and drink beer with the gods. At Ragnarok, they fight alongside Odin, Thor, Tyr, and the other gods of Asgard against the giants and the monsters such as the World Serpent and the Fenrir Wolf. What makes this wild Norse world so distinct is that this final battle is a battle that the gods and men have been foretold to lose. The winning side is chaos and unreason, the giants and the monsters. The gods are doomed with their allies to death. Thor, who is killed by the World Serpent, and Odin, who is killed by the Fenrir Wolf, cannot escape death any more than mortal man. Nevertheless, the gods who know that they will be defeated do not see certain defeat as a reason to give up, to stop fighting. And likewise men, their chosen allies in this war, can share in this perfect resistance when acting heroically, a resistance that is perfect because it is without hope. The Norse gods and men are fighting to the last. Whether they live or die, they will fight. Tolkien writes that Norse myth put the monsters in the center, gave them victory but no honor, and found a potent but terrible solution in naked will and courage. In describing the Norse gods from a Scottish and Northern European perspective, the writer Thomas Carlyle says, spiritually as well as bodily, these men are our progenitors. He says in Lecture 1, the hero as divinity, from heroes and hero worship. I take this to have been the soul of the whole Norse belief. They understood in their heart that it was indispensable to be brave. It is an everlasting duty, valid in our day as in that, the duty of being brave. Valor is still value. The first duty for a man is still that of subduing fear. We must get rid of fear. We cannot act at all till then. A man's acts are slavish, not true but specious. His very thoughts are false. He thinks too as a slave and a coward till he have got fear under his feet. A man shall and must be valiant. He must march forward and quit himself like a man, trusting imperturbably in the appointment and the choice of the upper powers, and on the whole, not fear at all. Now and always, the completeness of his victory over fear will determine how much of a man he is. 800 years ago, the Norwegians were still worshippers of Odin. It is interesting also, as the creed of our fathers, the men whose blood still runs in our veins, whom doubtless we still resemble in so many ways. Let us look a little at this poor Norse creed, for many reasons. We have tolerable means to do it, for there is another point of interest in these Scandinavian mythologies, that they have been preserved so well. What the essence of Scandinavian, and indeed all paganism is, a recognition of the forces of nature as godlike, stupendous, personal agencies, as gods and demons, not inconceivable to us. It is the infant thought of man opening itself with awe and wonder on this ever stupendous universe. To me, there is in the Norse system something very genuine, very great and manlike. A broad simplicity, rusticity, so very different from the light gracefulness of the old Greek paganism, distinguishes this very Scandinavian system. Thomas Carlyle refers to Odin as the first Norse thinker, and says there is this huge shadow of him which still projects itself over the whole history of his people. What this Odin saw into and taught with his runes and his rhymes, the whole Teutonic people laid to heart and carried forward. His way of thought became their way of thought. Such, under new conditions, is the history of every great thinker still. In gigantic confused lineaments, like some enormous camera, obscure shadow thrown upwards from the dead deeps of the past, and covering the whole northern heaven, is not that Scandinavian mythology, in some sort, the portraiture of this man Odin? In the chapter Nature Knowledge in Form and Actuality, Oswald Spengler criticizes the older interpretations of Faustian mythology, which separated Catholic and northern heathen elements as being opposed. Spengler instead asserts radically, some might say, that the transformation of Christian ideas and consolidation of pagan cults were actually two sides of the same creative act. Only in this way can we understand the immense wealth of religious intuitive creations that fills the 3 centuries of the imperial age of Germany. What came into existence then was the Faustian mythology. Hitherto, owing to religious and learned preconceptions, either the Catholic element has been treated to the exclusion of the northern heathen, or vice versa, and consequently we have been blind to the breadth and the unity of this form world. In reality, there is no such difference. The deep change of meaning in the Christian circle of ideas is identical as a creative act, with the consolidation of the old heathen cult of the migrations. It was in this age that the folklore of Western Europe became an entirety. If the bulk of its material was far older, and if far later again it came to be linked with new outer experiences and enriched by more conscious treatment, yet it was then, and neither earlier nor later, that it was vitalized with its symbolic meaning. To this lore belong the great god legends of the Edda, and many motives in the gospel, poetry of learned monks, the German hero, tales of Siegfried and Gudrun, Dietrich and Wayland, the vast wealth of chivalry tales derived from the ancient Celtic fables that was simultaneously coming to harvest on French soil concerning King Arthur and the Round Table, the Holy Grail, Tristan, Percival, and Roland. And with these are to be counted, beside the spiritual transvaluation, unremarked but all the deeper for that, of the Passion story, the Catholic hagiology, of which the richest Floriazin was in the 10th and 11th centuries, and which produced the Lives of the Virgin, and the histories of S.S. Rock, Severin, Francis, Bernard, Odilia. The Legenda Aurora was composed about 1250. This was the blossoming time of courtly epic and Icelandic skald poetry alike. He emphasizes the wholeness of Western European folklore, and even though its content came from various sources and evolved over time, He uses these examples of Germanic gods and legends and heroes in chivalric stories to point to a deeper unity with the simultaneous flowering of courtly epic and Icelandic poetry around 1250. Here he also mentions Catholic hagiology, which is the stories of the lives of the saints, and the connection between myths like Valhalla and Ragnarok with Christian equivalents like Muspelli. Spengler takes the radical position of internal unity and symbolic meaning across Faustian myth, stating that figures like Siegfried, Balder, and Christ ultimately represent one underlying archetype. Spengler writes, "The great Valhalla gods of the north and the mythic group of the 14 helpers in South Germany are contemporary, and by the side of Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods. In the Völuspá, we have a Christian form in the South German Muspelli. This great myth develops, like heroic poetry, at the climax of the early culture. They both belong to the two primary estates, priesthood and nobility. They are at home in the cathedral and the castle, and not in the village below, where amongst the people the simple saga world lives on for centuries, called fairy tale, popular beliefs, or superstition, and yet inseparable from the world of high contemplation. Nowhere is the final meaning of these religious creations more clearly indicated than in the history of Valhalla. It was not an original German idea, and even the tribes of the migrations were totally without it. It took shape just at this time, instantly, and as an inward necessity in the consciousness of the peoples newly arisen on the soil of the West. Thus, it is contemporary with Olympus, which we know from the Homeric epics, and which is as little Mycenaean as Valhalla is German in origin. Moreover, it is only for the two higher estates that Valhalla emerges from the notion of hell. In the beliefs of the people, hell remained the realm of the dead. The deep inward unity of this Faustian world of myth and saga, and the complete congruence of its expression symbolism, has never hitherto been realized, and yet Siegfried, Balder, Roland, Christ the King in the Helliend are different names for one and the same figure. Spengler continues on the topic of mythological development, saying, Valhalla and Avalon, the Round Table and the communion of the Grail Templars, Mary, Frigga, and Frau Halle mean the same. On the other hand, the external provenance of the material motives and elements on which mythological research has wasted an excessive zeal is a matter of which the importance does not go deeper than the surface. As to the meaning of a myth, its provenance proves nothing. The noumen itself, the primary form of the world feeling, is a pure, necessary, and unconscious creation, and it is not transferable. What one people takes over from another in conversion or in admiring imitation is a name, dress, and mask for its own feeling, never the feeling of that other. The Old Celtic and Old Germanic myth motives have to be treated like the repertory of classical forms possessed by the learned monk, and like the entire body of Christian Eastern faith taken over by the Western Church, simply as the material out of which the Faustian soul in these centuries created a mythic architecture of its own. It mattered little whether the persons through whose minds and mouths the myth came to life were individual skalds, missionaries, priests, or the people, nor did the circumstance that the Christian ideas dictated its forms affect the inward independence of that which had come to life. There's great value in examining how the gods face their end. Odin has his Valkyries seek out the most noble and brave and heroic men from across Midgard to gather the slain together in Valhall, where they train and feast and celebrate, awaiting and preparing for the day of battle. So Odin always has the end in mind. He never loses sight of the cosmic battle to come. Odin embodies cunning, wisdom, and foresight, always planning for the long-term fight, and the great winter war that he knows is coming. He listens to his two ravens, Hugin and Munin, who scout the skies and report knowledge to his ears. And to this end, he is setting in motion plans that are measured across generations. In our time, in a Spenglerian autumn or winter age, when subtlety, long-term vision and preparation are most needed. An Odinic mindset is more valuable than ever. Yet Odin's tragic weakness is that even his mighty gifts cannot surmount death itself. Even Odin, for as mighty and wise and far-sighted as he may be, is ultimately devoured by Fenrir, if the vulva is to be believed. Christ died as well, just as the Germanic gods died. But Christ won ultimate victory through his death and rose again. So in this way, Christ embodies northern courage, but he also embodies something that Odin is seeking. He embodies hope that we may yet be reborn and live with him after the fires and drowning of Ragnarok, after Apocalypse, in the new Midgard, the new restored Middle-earth, where a mighty and righteous king reigns for eternity. In this way, we can see Odin trying to learn the knowledge of Christ, and going to great lengths to discover the truth of what it will take to face Ragnarok, much as the Greek philosophers, and Plato in particular, were seeking truth and rediscovering God through philosophy. C.S. Lewis writes in Mere Christianity, "There are people in other religions who are being led to God's secret influence, to concentrate on those parts of their religion which are in agreement with Christianity, and who thus belong to Christ without knowing it." But Odin tries to survive Ragnarok without being devoured by darkness, by using the logic of the old world. He tries to fight his way into the next world using spears and armies and tactics, and although those are valuable, what is ultimately needed most is self-sacrifice for love. Odin must be willing to lay down his own life for the love of his friends and the coming king. Our Lord Jesus in the book of Matthew chapter 16 verse 25 says, "For whoever would save his life shall lose it, and whosoever shall lose his life for my sake shall find it." This is the path of the Christian martyr, the heroic path of self-sacrifice as exemplified by Christ's passion. As our Lord says, "Greater love hath no man than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends." Thus Odin must embrace the chivalric courage of martyrdom that he demands of his Einhar, and must die for Christ if he is to find true life after Ragnarok. Christ shows this narrow way, this path through a ravine to move through death into the new land, into resurrection. Reading stanza 64 of Völuspá, I'm struck by the connection to chapter 19 of the book of Revelation. "More fair than the sun, a hall I see, roofed with gold, on Gimli it stands. There shall the righteous rulers dwell, and happiness ever there shall they have. There comes on high all power to hold, a mighty Lord, all lands he rules." In the book of Revelation chapter 19, verses 11 through 16. "Now I saw heaven opened, and behold a white horse, and he who sat on him was called Faithful and True, and in righteousness he judges and makes war. His eyes were like a flame of fire, and on his head were many crowns. He had a name written that no one knew except himself. He was clothed with a robe dipped in blood, and his name is called the Word of God. And the armies in heaven, clothed in fine linen, white and clean, followed him on white horses. Now out of his mouth goes a sharp sword, and that with it he should strike the nations. And he himself will rule them with a rod of iron. He himself treads the winepress of the fierceness and wrath of Almighty God. And he has on his robe and on his thigh a name written, King of Kings and Lord of Lords." Carlyle writes, "Has he, Odin, not solved for them the Sphinx enigma of this universe, given assurance to them of their own destiny there? By him they know now what they have to do here, what to look for hereafter. Existence has become articulate, melodious by him. He first has made life alive. We may call this Odin, the origin of Norse mythology." In some sense, you could even see Odin as the mythological equivalent of a John the Baptist figure, preparing the way in the north for Christ's arrival by aligning the northern soul towards the transcendent, heroic, eternal Father. This tradition, more of reconciliation than syncretism, is also affirmed by the Catholic Church in Nostra Aetate, in which Pope Paul VI writes, "Men expect from the various religions answers to the unsolved riddles of the human condition, which today, even as in former times, deeply stir the hearts of men. What is man? What is the meaning and the aim of our life? What is moral good? What is sin? Whence suffering, and what purpose does it serve? Which is the road to true happiness? What are death, judgment, and retribution after death? What finally is that ultimate, inexpressible mystery which encompasses our existence? Whence do we come, and where are we going?" From ancient times down to the present, there is found among various peoples a certain perception of that hidden power which hovers over the course of things, and over the events of human history. At times some indeed have come to the recognition of a supreme being, or even of a father. This perception and recognition penetrates their lives with a profound religious sense. Religions, however, that are bound up with an advanced culture have struggled to answer the same questions by means of more refined concepts and a more developed language. The Catholic Church rejects nothing that is true and holy in these religions. She regards with sincere reverence those ways of conduct and of life, those precepts and teachings, though differing in many aspects from the ones she holds and sets forth, nonetheless often reflect a ray of that truth which enlightens all men. Indeed, she proclaims and ever must proclaim Christ, the way, the truth, and the life, John 14:6, in whom men may find the fullness of religious life, in whom God has reconciled all things to himself. So we should emulate Odin's strategic intelligence, his ability to rally warriors under his banner and in his great hall, which are needed in the wars ahead. But we must transcend these traits with Christ's call for martyrdom, for total self-sacrifice, if we are to attain spiritual victory and victory over mortality. Like Christ, we should lead with selfless love and be willing to lay down our lives. C.S. Lewis, in his 1942 essay, First and Second Things, writes about Odin and the Germanic gods, saying, "What business have people who call might right to worship Odin? The whole point about Odin was that he had the right, but not the might. The point about Norse religion was that it alone of all mythologies told men to serve gods who were admittedly fighting with their backs to the wall and would certainly be defeated in the end. I am off to die with Odin," said the rover in Stevenson's fable, proving Stevenson understood something about the Nordic spirit. The gods will fall. The wisdom of Odin, the humorous courage of Thor — Thor was something of a Yorkshireman — and the beauty of Balder will all be smashed eventually by the realpolitik of the stupid giants and misshapen trolls. But that does not in the least alter the allegiance of any free man. Hence, as we should expect, real Germanic poetry is all about heroic stands and fighting against hopeless odds. He represents the next phase of heroism beyond Odin's strength and cunning. Christ brings us through Ragnarok to the new reborn Midgard. Christ's story arc answers Ragnarok's unsolved riddle, how to pass through death into new life. He represents the next phase of heroism beyond Odin's strength and cunning. In Christ, the stories of Odin and all mythic heroes can find their ultimate meaning and baptism. In this way, the stories of the pagan gods are not separate from the stories of Christianity in some separate canon, just as the stories of Rome are not separate from the stories of Gaul and Germany and Greece. They play out in history around us, even to this day. It could be that some of the groundwork of this syncretism or reconciliation was already laid out by Snorri and the writers of the Middle Ages. But it's also likely that many of these parallels and connections exist naturally, as they are descended from a singular primordial truth. Germanic mythology never strayed far from the root as some other religious traditions did, keeping in itself much of the same core spiritual truth, preparing itself even in a subliminal way for the arrival of Christ to complete its story of Ragnarok.